Howdy my totally, as always, Tubular Gamers. We're back with another video. Thanks for coming back to the channel. I got another ranking video for you. Today we're going to be talking about the Stalker games. With Stalker 2 Heart of Chernobyl finally releasing after all these years, I thought I would take a look at the entire Stalker franchise. I've been a fan of this franchise since I was a teenager, and have found quite a bit of enjoyment in this franchise. So, for the unfamiliar, Stalker is actually an acronym for Scavengers, Trespassers, Adventurers, Loners, Killers, Explorers, and Robbers. Yeah, all that's kind of a mouthful, so we're just gonna call it Stalker from here on out. Anyway, it's a series of first-person shooters set in the modern day, and it takes place in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, also known as the Zone, in Ukraine. If you don't know about the Chernobyl disaster, well, simply put, it absolutely was a disaster. It's considered the worst nuclear disaster in history, and this series actually takes place in an alternate universe where there's a second Chernobyl disaster. Yeah, this place just can't catch any breaks, and as a result of this second disaster, the whole area is just totally fucked with. There's radiation all over the place, nature-defying anomalies, artifacts, and plenty of mutants ready to kill just about anything they can see. And so these games see you play as John Stalker. Okay, no, you just play as somebody who is a stalker, which is the name that they gave trespassers and adventurers who come to this fucked up zone looking for treasure and other strange phenomena. So yeah, this series has a pretty interesting setting. When it comes to why people like these games, they're pretty solid first-person shooters taking place in these big open worlds where you have to deal with creatures, other trespassers, and all of the weird shit going on here. All of the just straight-up nature-defying anomalies that show up in this awful place. But there's plenty of treasure and things to be found. There's a lot of survival elements with these games. You have to manage your inventory and some resources. There's plenty of quests and factions to help out, and all of these games have killer atmospheres. That's something Stalker's really well known for, is just having unique, engrossing worlds that you can find yourself getting lost in the very best of ways. These games are also known for being incredibly janky. These games were incredibly ambitious, and sometimes not everything works as intended. And so with that, I'm going to be ranking these games worst to best, stacking them up against each other, giving each one of these games a little review since I do have quite a bit to say about every single one of them, sharing my thoughts, feelings, memories, etc., and generally just seeing which games are even worth playing nowadays. As always, this is purely based off of my own experiences, and I do want to make it clear I played all of these games vanilla. I did not play them with mods. I know those can be some real game changers for this franchise, but I've always experienced this series raw. Okay, this intro's gone on long enough. Please like, share, comment, subscribe. I got the Patreon and the super thanks. Any support is truly greatly appreciated. Seriously, thank you all very much. I don't have a team or people helping me. It's just me playing and talking about these games. All the support is greatly appreciated. Let's get into the games. What's the weakest of the Stalker series? It should come as no surprise to anybody that's played this series that the weakest of the Stalker games is Stalker Clear Sky, releasing initially in 2008. So Clear Sky is actually a prequel to Shadow of Chernobyl, and it sees you playing as this mercenary known as Scar, and he's tasked with stopping a group of stalkers from reaching the center of the zone, which is considered like this forbidden territory. While the story is somewhat interesting and the atmosphere is there for the most part, I just didn't find this story anywhere near as compelling as Shadow of Chernobyl or Call of Pripyat, but there is a certain appeal to seeing all of these areas from Shadow of Chernobyl before the events of Shadow of Chernobyl. And like I said, for the most part, I think they did a pretty decent job with the atmosphere. It's got good vibes to it. One of the reasons it has good vibes to it is because it looks nearly identical to Shadow of Chernobyl. Like, at times, I have difficulty distinguishing the two. They look very similar. They reuse assets, environments, animations, etc., but I still think the game is actually pretty good graphically. What I don't think is all that great is, sadly, the gameplay. Now, Stalker has never had the most refined, polished experience. That's just never been part of its DNA. It's always been a bit janky, but Clear Sky really takes things to another level. Unfortunately though, to get to that level you gotta go into the toilet bowl and down the pipes, because yeah, it's not that great. When it comes to the actual moment-to-moment gameplay, it is very similar to Shadow of Chernobyl. You're dropped into these relatively large zones, and there's plenty of things to do. You're given quests, you can join factions, you can help out certain factions, you can't join everybody, you can go find anomalies, and you'll get into plenty of firefights, and all of that sounds well and good, but it just kinda collapses in Clear Sky. Stalker is first and foremost a first-person shooter with survival elements. The survival elements have been turned down here. There's not as many many resources to manage, which was an interesting decision. And then we have the first-person shooter aspect, which unfortunately just isn't very good. This series has just kind of always had issues when it comes to the shooting, where your crosshair is on the enemy, you've got a good weapon, you're firing off a bunch of shots, and they're just not even reacting, and it feels like the bullets are just completely missing. Well, that's at its absolute worst in Clear Sky, where your weapons just feel wildly ineffective. You'll have your crosshair right on the enemy, you'll be point blank with that enemy shooting away, and they're just not even reacting. They're not even acting like they're getting hit, and you're not even sure if you're hitting these people. The shooting, it's just terrible. Like, the weapons do feel kind of nice when you actually hit things, but it feels more often than not that you just completely miss for no discernible reason. And yes, I know that there are mods that fix this. I know that if you turn the difficulty up, apparently the shooting and the accuracy gets better, but man, I shouldn't have to do that. When I point my gun at an enemy and I click the mouse button, I expect the bullets to hit said enemy a majority of the time, not just completely miss for really no good reason. I will say, like the prior game, the more you play this game, the better the shooting becomes. You get better weapons that are apparently just more accurate, and you can kill enemies much faster with these. But the beginning of the game should not be anywhere near as difficult as it is, and you shouldn't have the shittiest weapons imaginable. Like, you're trying to leave a good impression on people. It's the beginning of the game. It shouldn't be the hardest part of the game. Arguably, every Stalker game has this issue where it just has a really crummy start, but it's way worse in Clear Sky than any of the other Stalker games. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if a majority of people who played this game dropped it after an hour or two because they went, the shooting is just awful, these weapons are terrible, and it's just not enjoyable at all. And it really just cripples this entire experience. What would be cool set pieces or awesome locations, really interesting, engaging quests, just become more frustrating than anything else because you're just constantly missing every shot you take. And then, like I mentioned, the survival elements feel turned down. Getting the artifacts is not as interesting as the prior games. It feels more like luck than anything else. The way you equip them is a little different. There's just a lot of trial and error where you just die over and over and over trying to get these stupid things. I didn't find any of the quests or areas anywhere near as exciting as the previous game. The game has factions you can join, but it feels like this was thrown in just kind of haphazardly. They don't have a huge effect on the game, and they feel really underdeveloped. Not to mention buggy in their own right. The AI can feel just overly punishing in this game, not due to like these advanced tactics or anything, it's just that they're crazy accurate and always know where to throw grenades apparently. And the story was just kind of there. And this is on top of all the usual jank this series is known for and general trial and error. Like, this game easily has the highest barrier to entry and it's the least enjoyable game. By the time I was done with this, I really just wanted it to end. I'd rather play legit any of the other Stalker games, and I just can't really recommend this one. I'm sure there are plenty of mods that fix every single aspect I just talked about, but I still couldn't really recommend this game. Maybe if you're like a die-hard Stalker fan, then sure, go ahead and try it. Maybe you'll have more fun with it than I did, but this has always been the weakest game in the series for me. So here we have it, Stalker 2 Heart of Chernobyl. It's finally out after many years of development, a war, and just a whole lot of shit. We can finally play the game. So how is it? I think it's actually pretty good. I really wasn't sure how this game was going to be. It had been 15 years since the prior Stalker game. A lot of the industry, a lot of the world has changed since then. But GSC, they stuck to their guns and they made something that's not only incredibly faithful to the original games, but something that can actually stand on its own. So when it comes to this game's setting, story, characters, etc., it is a bit different from the prior game. You actually play as a voiced protagonist, this man named Skiff, who's just chilling in his apartment when half of it's just totally blown up by this artifact that belongs to the zone. Normally this doesn't happen, since if it's not in the zone, artifacts aren't supposed to do anything. And so Skiff heads into the zone to figure out just what exactly happened, and yeah, I'll just say he gets wrapped up into a lot of shit. I actually think the story is pretty good in this game. Skiff is a decent protagonist. He actually has a little bit of a personality, and I found the story rather intriguing for the most part. At times, it does feel like it gets really bogged down with just a whole lot of other shit that has nothing to do with Skiff and the artifact, but eventually it all wraps back together. Something that this game really focuses on is the factions. More so than probably any other Stalker game. They make up a majority of the story. A lot of the choices you make in the game have to do with the factions as well. Obviously, the factions don't really like each other, and you can get some pretty different outcomes depending on what you choose. I will say, though, while I do find the story intriguing and interesting, the pacing of it isn't all that great. great. When I meant you get bogged down with a lot of shit, I'm talking like hours and hours of you getting wrapped up in just a bunch of shit that has really nothing to do with Skiff's journey or the artifact at all, and sometimes it can even get to the point where I'm like, wait, what is even happening anymore? What does this have to do with the artifact? But eventually, yes, eventually everything starts to come back together, and yeah, I think the story's good in this game. It's not going to win any awards, and the dialogue, along with the voice acting, isn't anything special, but I think it more than gets the job done. Something that I wasn't sure this game was going to be able to nail like the old games did was the atmosphere. I was like, are they really going to be able to recapture the magic of the older games, especially on Unreal Engine 5? And while I don't think the atmosphere is as strong as the old games, I think it still is pretty good in this game. It's still got a mood, it's still got a vibe. When you're just out in a dark forest and you hear thunder hitting the ground or a storm getting started or maybe a mutant, yeah, the game does hit different. It's got a better atmosphere than a majority of games released nowadays, and it really allowed me to become just fully engrossed in this world, which is exactly what I want from a Stalker game. I think they did a pretty good job when it comes to the atmosphere, vibe, and setting. Now, when it comes to the gameplay, this is unabashedly a Stalker video game. They really didn't change that much from the older games. If you're someone who didn't care for the older Stalker games, you're not going to like this. They didn't try to modernize it or tweak it for a current audience or anything like that. They made a Stalker video game. It plays pretty similarly to the older games. A majority of the game is scavenging and getting into firefights. And in between all of that, you're going back and forth across this giant zone, talking to characters, taking on jobs, and managing your very, very limited inventory along with those basic survival elements. And I think all of this actually really does come together to create a very compelling gameplay loop that feels completely different from any other game released in 2024. This game at times feels like a throwback, not only to the older Stalker games, but to older games in general. The game can also be quite punishing, more punishing than even the original games. When it comes to the survival elements, this game isn't messing around. Not only do you have to manage your health and stamina, but you gotta manage your hunger and radiation. You're going to be needing to eat a lot of food, and if you get radiated at all, usually you want to drink some alcohol to get rid of them rads, because the rads really aren't messing around in this game. They give you a visual effect, and if you get too radiated, yeah, you just fall over and die. And on top of all this, you got to manage your inventory. You got a pretty stingy weight limit. You don't have a lot of space here, and if your bag starts to get pretty full, not only can you barely run, but in some cases you just can't run at all. So managing your inventory, that's going to be a big aspect to this game as well. If you're someone who really complains about being over encumbered in games, Stalker 2 might not be the game for you. There's a lot of scavenging, but you're not going to be able to pick everything up thanks to the small inventory. A lot of the game is scavenging, just picking things up, going through people's inventory and finding things. But sometimes people aren't going to take too kindly to you picking up everything that isn't bolted to the ground, and you'll get into some combat. The combat in Stalker 2 is actually rather punishing. The enemies can completely wreck your shit in seconds on the normal difficulty. There's really two categories when it comes to enemies in this game: other humans and the mutants. The other humans can put you down really fast. They are very powerful and have no problem just fucking you up. And sometimes they will actually have some decent AI holding back, camping, waiting for you to come to them, or squatting up and going against you all at once. It's not as smart as the original game, and sometimes the AI has been rather inconsistent and they'll do dumbass things, but for the most part, I think the AI is competent. And then fighting the mutants is pretty similar to the original game, where they'll either all just gang up on you at once or they just do hit and run tactics. I will say though, the mutants take a lot of punishment in this game, way more than the older games. They feel very bullet spongy, and some of them just take way too long to kill, like those invisible fuckers. Gosh, I really hate these guys. Like, they just take so much abuse in this game. The combat is easily the most difficult combat of the entire series. Like, I found myself just getting thoroughly wrecked several times by almost every single enemy type in this game. It's actually kind of impressive. But I will also say, this game easily has the best gunplay of the entire series. A lot of the weapons feel really good in this game, and unlike the older games, when your crosshair is on an enemy, the bullet always hits them. All that random miss crap from the older games, it's totally absent here. It behaves like a normal first-person shooter, and yeah, it does feel nice. Well, it feels nice until an enemy headshots you and you die like instantly. Then you're just like, well, what the fuck, man. Outside of the combat and scavenging, the rest of the gameplay really is just you going from point A to B, talking to some individuals, maybe trading, or doing the odd job here and there. While there's plenty of main quests to do, there are actually a decent amount of side quests, and while these aren't the most imaginative side quests, it's usually just go here, kill someone, or get something. But these side quests actually have some pretty good rewards. This game in general does reward you for going off the beaten path, checking out stashes, helping people, or doing side quests. Yeah, you actually get some really good shit in this game. While it's not much of an RPG and you don't level up or gain experience, they'll give you stuff like new parts for your guns, which are actually way more helpful than you might think, or maybe something that helps it with the durability. The durability of these weapons is dog shit in this game. Like, it feels like every weapon's ready to break in your hands and they start jamming, and I'm just like, oh, what the fuck, man? But even though it can be a little annoying, I think it actually adds a pretty good wrinkle to the combat and the feel of the game in general. This is a very slow-paced game, and you absolutely cannot play it like Black Ops. It plays like the older Stalker games. Very few things have been modified. Quick using items is a little different from Call of Pripyat, which is super helpful, and the user interface has been cleaned up a little bit, and what do you know, it's actually well done. So yeah, what I just described to you, the gameplay of Stalker 2, it's the gameplay of a Stalker game. They didn't reinvent the wheel here. They didn't come up with a bunch of new ideas or new ways to, quote, modernize it or try to attract a new audience. It's rough around the edges. It absolutely takes some time to get used to, and it can be brutally punishing in certain areas, but I think for the most part, this is a very compelling experience. I do have a few issues with it, though. It's not all peaches here. Getting the artifacts and using the artifacts in this game, it just kinda sucks. For whatever reason, they made it like Clear Sky, where you have to go into these anomaly areas and the artifact is invisible and you kind of just walk around hoping it shows up in front of you, and you'll probably die over and over and over. There's a bunch of trial and error when it comes to getting the artifacts, and I just don't know why they made obtaining the artifacts like this. It wasn't fun in Clear Sky, it was annoying then, and it's annoying now. And what sucks even more is that these artifacts, they don't appear to be very good. I actually haven't found one at all that was even remotely useful. They all do things like slightly reduce electricity damage or slightly increase fire resistance, and I'm like, where's the good shit, like the older games? Maybe I just never found any of them, but I thought the artifact hunting and the artifacts themselves were a bit disappointing. Something else that's worth bringing up is that this game, I'll just be blunt about it, it's way too big. It wastes your time with how big it is. Like, the old games had decent sized maps, but this game is way bigger than the other games, and you spend a lot of time just running back and forth with very little happening. And a lot of the missions are go here and come back, and it's like halfway across the map, no exaggeration. There is fast travel, but it's very limited, and I just wish it was a bit better. It doesn't need to be like Skyrim or Fallout where you fast travel everywhere all over the place, but I think even a little bit more fast travel would have been useful, because running back and forth in the same areas over and over, it really does start to get old. My first like dozen hours of the game, I was fine with running across this map. I enjoyed it even. It was cool to see all these locations, but eventually it just becomes really draining and rather dull. I mean, you're just going back and forth. If you have a bunch of energy drinks, at least you can speed this up with your stamina staying up. But sometimes I just wish it got to the point. This is also a really big, long game. It is longer than the older Stalker games. It's well over the 20 or 25 hour mark, and at times, I don't really know if this gameplay can hold up for that long. Like, it has a good amount of depth, but like 30 plus hours worth of depth, you can be the judge of that. And then of course you can make choices throughout, and there's different endings depending on the factions you help and side with, etc, etc. So there is replayability, but honestly, I'm probably not going to be playing this game again for quite some time. And it's not because I didn't enjoy it, it's just, yeah, it's a pretty big, somewhat draining experience. And like most Stalker games, the intro, it can be a little rough. I imagine there are going to be plenty of people that will play the first few hours and not like the gameplay here. It takes some time to get going. And then my last complaint, the last thing I want to bring up, is the performance and optimization. I played this game on PC and played it after that huge day one patch. I even streamed it to you all, and if you dropped into that stream, thank you very much, but you probably all saw that the game was running like crap on my computer. I don't have a great PC. I got a 3070 and a decent processor, but at times, man, this game, it just runs terribly. Sometimes there's like memory leaks and the game just comes down to a crawl. We're talking like under 10 frames a second, especially when you go into some of the bigger towns. I had tons of graphical issues, environment environments not loading properly, the lighting going crazy, the game's actually just straight flickering, NPCs glitching out, lots of graphical issues. Like, this game looks incredible. It's a real looker of a game, but man, there really were some graphical issues with it. Now, when it comes to gameplay glitches or issues, I really didn't have any issues there actually. Surprisingly, there wasn't really any defects or bugs when it came to the gameplay, but the optimization for this game, man, it just isn't very good. And all I can say is if you're going to play this game on PC, utilize Steam's 2-hour refund period, make sure your computer can actually run it, and make sure you're getting a steady frame rate, and turn off frame generation. I was out here thinking the shooting was really sluggish and felt like it was underwater, but it turns out the frame generation was just fucking with the movement really badly. This game actually does feel really good. But that of course is just the PC version. I can't speak on the Xbox version, and I'm sure it'll come to PlayStation eventually, and hopefully those versions are okay. Now, I know I've been rambling for a second, but I want to address one last thing. I have heard people compare this launch to Cyberpunk 2077, saying it's a Cyberpunk level launch, wait for patches, wait for fixes. This game is nowhere, and I mean nowhere near as broken as Cyberpunk was at release. I can't speak for the people who played it during the pre-release review phase, but as somebody who's been playing it pretty non-stop for the last few days since it released, yeah, it's nowhere near as broken as some people will lead you to believe. Are there bugs, glitches, and performance issues? Absolutely, but it's not this unplayable broken mess like Cyberpunk was. Anyway, let me wrap things up here with Stalker 2. Is the game worth playing? Absolutely, in my opinion. If you're someone who likes first-person shooters, you like survival games, or you're looking for just something different, I think this game is worth trying. It's very different from everything else on the market, and I really enjoyed it. I could not stop playing it, and it's easily one of my favorite games of the entire year. It's got issues, but what this game does well, it does really well. I absolutely recommend that people try it. Even if you've never played one of these games, I think you're going to enjoy it. And if you have, and you like those older games, oh, you're going to love this one. So here we have the original Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl, releasing initially in 2007. I didn't play this one when it came out. I played it a few years later in like 2010, and I remember just being absolutely hooked on this game. I had never played anything like this at the time. The game just had such an immersive, engrossing world that I sat down and I played through the whole game in like a week, and it was a great time. The original Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl is a total classic. So with this game being the first in the series, it really set up the world and premise of the Stalker games, where it's set in an alternate reality where there was a second disaster of mysterious origin at the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and now there's all this freaky deaky shit going down. There's these anomalies showing up, there's these mutants and creatures, and apparently treasures to be had, so people go to this zone looking for fame and fortune. This game sees you playing the identity of someone known as the Marked One, an amnesiac trying to find and kill this mysterious Strelok in the zone. You got no idea who this person is, nobody else seems to know either, but you know that you gotta kill them, and that's all I'm gonna say for the story, because I actually think it is pretty good in this game. I think it's got a really interesting hook right off the bat. Like, you gotta find this Strelok fella. The world is just so interesting in Stalker, and the way things progress, it just gets crazier and crazier, and there's actually different endings to this game as well. This game might have the best story of the entire series. Like, all these years later, I think it actually is still really great. Something else that the original Stalker has that none of the other Stalker games have to this extent is the atmosphere. Man, the atmosphere, the vibe of the original game is untouched. Don't get it twisted, all of the Stalker games have really great atmospheres to them. It's just, this original game really just hit different. Maybe it's because it was the first game and it was the first one that I ever played, but this has one of the very best atmospheres of any video game. There is so much soul and life to this world, and it's just able to get this feeling out of me that most video games cannot. Even just overlooking some old gameplay footage, it just takes me back. It takes me back to a different time, and it really felt incredibly immersive, which is what Stalker is all about. It's all about getting immersed into this fascinating, strange, sometimes otherworldly zone. This game's atmosphere, it really is just all that, and I think the presentation really helps things out also. For 2007, I think this was a really good looking game. There's a lot of detail to everything, from the environments to the character models to the weapons. Like, it looks good even nowadays. The presentation was excellent, and the sound design is just incredible in this game. Like, the main theme is just goated. The main theme is amazing in this game. It has so much personality to it, and I still listen to it to this day, but other tracks that show up in the game are really great. The way the guns sound, how the anomalies sound, and how it all just comes together. The sound design really helps build up that atmosphere. But hey, let's actually talk about, you know, playing the video game. So the original Stalker Stalker isn't all that different from all the other ones. You're dropped into this pretty big area, and you're pretty much just given the freedom to explore. Unlike the later Stalker games, here instead of it being just a giant open world, it's actually a bunch of little interconnected zones, which I always thought was interesting, but the pacing and progression is pretty much the same as the other ones, where you're just free to explore, and there's plenty to see in the zone. There's people to help, random jobs here and there to take. Obviously, there is your main quest line. There's plenty of people that want to kill you and plenty of mutants that also want to rip your face off, and then of course you can go find the artifacts. The game has some survival elements which were actually very uncommon for when this game came out. Not only do you have to manage your health and stamina, but you have to manage your food and water as well. You also got to be wary of radiation levels. There is a bit more going on under the hood than you might expect, but what you're doing most of the time is scavenging and shooting. Scavenging is pretty self-explanatory. You can loot just about everything. You have rather limited inventory space, and you'll constantly be managing it as you play the game. When it comes to the shooting and how the guns feel, I think they actually do feel pretty good. They got a nice kick to them, they got some really nice sound effects, and you can feel an impact sometimes. When it comes to the general flow of combat, I think it is pretty impressive, especially nowadays. The AI aren't dumb as shit. They actually have tactics. Like, sure, some of them will run at you guns blazing, some mutants will just charge you head on, but plenty of them will hold back and wait. They'll camp, they'll hide in bushes, or some mutants will wait till there's a few of them to all gang up on you at once. Like, you're gonna actually need some tactics here. You might even need a little bit of strategy when going up against these enemies, which I could not say the same for Clear Sky, where the enemies are dumb as rocks a lot of the time. And all of this sounds really great. Wow, the gunfights are really engaging. The game can get incredibly challenging, and yeah, it absolutely can. It can be pretty punishing at times. If the enemies get the drop on you, you're fucking dead. And I think a majority of the combat is actually really great, but I do have one glaring issue with it. Like the other older Stalker games, the shooting is just really unreliable. You will aim the crosshair at an enemy, you will shoot, and the bullet will just not hit them. It's not as bad as Clear Sky, where it felt like half the time you were just totally missing, but it still happens, where it just seems at times completely random whether or not you're actually going to hit the enemy or not, and it seems to be the same for them. I've heard that if you play on the harder difficulty, it lowers the chance that your bullets just don't hit the enemies, and yeah, I just never really understood why it was like this. I've always played on just the normal difficulty, and I've always hated when my bullets just go into the ether, into the shadow realm, and I don't hit anything at all. Even though I've literally got my crosshair on the enemy with like a high-powered rifle, yeah, I just totally miss, and it seems like the enemies miss quite often as well. And yes, I'm aware that there are fan fixes and balancing mods that try to address this issue, but I played this game vanilla. I've always played this game vanilla. It's on consoles now where you're forced into a vanilla experience. I shouldn't need a mod to, quote, fix the gunplay. It's easily my biggest issue with the combat and probably the game as a whole. That, and that the first hour or two is pretty rough. All you have is this shitty pistol. You have to deal with the bullets just not hitting the enemies half the time, and they can just absolutely wipe the floor with you. You also don't have any supplies, and you're still figuring out how everything comes together. But trust me, you make it past the first hour or two, the game really hooks you in, you get into the swing of things, and the game becomes incredibly enjoyable. Unlike Clear Sky, where it just never felt like you got out of those rough early hours until you were almost done with the game. Here, it's a lot more manageable, and the pacing is actually pretty good throughout. I think the pacing and progression in the original game is actually really great. You're constantly going to new areas, getting new quests, finding new creatures and people to kill, and then you actually get to make a few choices throughout the game that will affect your ending. I love this original game, and despite it being a little rough around the edges at times, I think it still is very playable nowadays. I've played through it a few times, and I truly believe it's one of those unforgettable experiences I've had that helps shape me to be the gamer that I am today. Does the game have issues? Absolutely. It can be rather janky, the combat can be all over the place, some of the areas don't feel all that well designed, getting the artifacts can be a total pain in the ass and not feel worth it at times, and the second half is certainly better than the first half, but damn it, this game's got so much going for it still, a great presentation, an interesting world and atmosphere, the story's actually well done, the game can be very scary at times, and it's just got this vibe, this feel about it that none of the other Stalker games have. And I think even all these years later, the game is still totally worth playing. And here we have what I believe to be the best of the Stalker games, Stalker Call of Pripyat, which initially released in 2009. I know that Call of Pripyat might not get the same attention or love as the original game or Stalker 2, but I really do think this is the best Stalker experience. When it comes to this game's story, it takes place after the original game and sees a multitude of stalkers and the military rushing into the zone for, I'll just say, reasons. And it sees your main character, Major Alexander, investigating the zone on behalf of the army. When it comes to the story, I think it's pretty good in this game. It's intriguing, it's different from the other Stalker games, and I think it stays interesting throughout. Is it as compelling as the original game? Is there as much mystery as the original game? No. I think the original game and Stalker 2 do a better job with the story, characters, and world building, but I still really do like Call of Pripyat's story, and I do like how things progress. Something else I want to bring up immediately is this game's atmosphere. It definitely goes for a different vibe and atmosphere from the original game, and while I think it is really good, it's not the original game. And so you're probably going now, why does this guy think this is the best one? The story and the world and atmosphere aren't as good as the original, and in some cases the second game. It's the gameplay. I think the gameplay of Call of Pripyat is the best of the entire Stalker series. It didn't reinvent the wheel here or anything like that. It really is just a refinement on what the original game had. Instead of there being a bunch of small interconnected zones, it's a large open world and you can go do whatever the hell you want. There's plenty of things to loot and scavenge, tons of random jobs here and there to take on, plenty of things that want to kill you, and a bunch of factions that are all going up against each other, and of course the mysterious artifacts that are all over the place. But the moment-to-moment gameplay consists of a few things. All the survival elements, you have to manage several different resources here beyond just your health. You're going to be managing your inventory and all of your items. You don't want to be over-encumbered, but you want to have plenty of shit just in case things go south. Maybe you need some bandages, maybe you need some alcohol for the radiation. There's plenty of things you're going to be picking up and hanging on to for quite some time in this game. I think all of the survival elements and managing your inventory is the best here. And of course, you're going to be getting into plenty of firefights. There's a lot of firefights in Call of Pripyat, and I think the combat is just as good as the original game. The AI are pretty smart for the most part. The mutants go down rather quickly when compared to the second game, and they've all got advanced tactics here and there. I think the gunplay feels pretty nice, and at times it still does the random number crunching bullshit, I guess, where your bullets just don't hit anything even though the crosshair's on the enemy, but it happens the least in this one of the original 3 games. It barely even happens once you get to the later parts of the game, but it still does show up here. I think the combat really is some of the best combat of the entire series. There's plenty of interesting areas that you get into gunfights with. The AI keep things interesting, and the game does a great job of keeping you on your toes and keeping things tense. You'll never know exactly what to expect from these enemies, and they put you in some pretty dark, depressing areas where enemies will just be jumping out at you, and it can actually be scary. It can feel claustrophobic. People have always said that the Stalker games can be scary, and I absolutely think they're all horror games to some extent, except fucking Clear Sky. Anyway, I think the combat is very well done in Call of Pripyat, maybe the best in the entire series. Legit, it actually is pretty great. I also think you go to plenty of awesome environments in this game. Sure, it might not be the most varied visually, but I think these are all well-designed areas and they're all a decent amount of distance from each other, but it's not too much like the second game. You don't spend just a shit ton of time running around from place to place, and I think this is the best open world that the series ever saw. It's also incredibly interactive. There's just a lot going on here, and the game does a really good job of making it feel like a lived-in world where things are happening around you. It doesn't all center around the player. The first and second game do a good job with this, but nowhere near as good as Call of Pripyat. It just feels like a really lived-in world, and it's really easy to get immersed into it. And one reason it's so immersive is the factions. There's a ton of different factions in this game, and unlike Clear Sky, they're actually really well thought out. They're not super glitchy, and they'll constantly be fighting each other. These are probably the best factions of the entire series as well. They've all got their own reasons or motives, backstory, lore. It's pretty great stuff, and you get plenty of missions from them, and you can't side with everybody. And then depending on how things play out, you can get some really amazing set pieces. The set piece where you're going to Pripyat with your squad through the tunnels, it might be the best set piece of like the entire franchise. I think the pacing and progression of this game is really great. Also, you're constantly getting new weapons, going to new areas, you get to upgrade your weapons, you feel more and more powerful, and the game isn't just significantly better in the second half. This game easily has the best beginning of any Stalker game. It's kind of crazy. Even Stalker 2 has a rather rough first few hours, but not really with Call of Pripyat. I mean, it does a little bit, but the barrier to entry, the learning curve, is nowhere near as big as the prior games. Maybe it's because this was the third Stalker game I was going into, but I think the first few hours are actually decently well done, and it's not frustrating, or at least not as frustrating as prior games. Speaking of not as frustrating, we have the artifacts. It is more like Clear Sky, where, you know, they're invisible in between a bunch of anomalies, and there is a decent amount of trial and error here, but it's not as annoying as Clear Sky or Stalker 2. I don't know, I didn't die any anywhere near as many times, and you actually can just find some artifacts out in the wild that are just going crazy by themselves, and I think that's pretty cool. The artifacts are actually good in this game as well. They actually really help out your player and are totally worth getting, unlike say Stalker 2 where they did jack shit. I think the artifacts are alright. The last thing I want to bring up is that this might be the most polished Stalker game of them all. Like, don't get it twisted. It still is rough around the edges at times. There are still some bugs and glitches, but for the most part, this was actually rather polished and really well put together. The game looks pretty good also. There's a lot of detail. It's got a nice aesthetic, and it really does have a mood to it, especially when those storms show up. Yeah, there's storms in Stalker 2, but Call of Pripyat, I really like how the storms look. So all in all, while Call of Pripyat might not have the best story or atmosphere or world of the Stalker games, it easily is the best experience overall. It's the most refined, it's the most polished, it's got a lot of depth to it. I think the pacing and progression is really great. It has the best environments, and it was just a really fun time. The enemies are really smart, the game is engrossing, it's scary, it's tense, it'll keep you on your toes, it'll make you look around every corner carefully, and it was just a joy to play through. While I might not have memories or nostalgia with this game like I do with, say, the original, I really do think this is the best one. If you're somebody who's maybe been on the fence with the series or you're unsure, you could try the original, or you could just try the best one with Call of Pripyat. Either way, I think you're going to be happy. I really do love this series. It's one of my favorite series of first-person shooters, and there's really just never been anything else like it. Sure, there's Metro, sure there's Escape from Tarkov, and even Chernobyl Light, but none of them hit like how Stalker does. It's crazy we finally did get Stalker 2 and that it's even any good at all, but I'm just happy that the spotlight is on this series once again because it absolutely deserves it. It tried to do something different in the 2000s, it had a personality, and I think all these years later, these games absolutely do stick out. So that's it for this video. I talked about all the Stalker games pretty in depth. Yeah, I went on longer than I probably anticipated, but I just had a lot to say about these games. I love this series. What can I say? I'm a bit of a rambler. So that's the code word for today, Rambler. You already know what to do. If you made it to this part of the video, thank you so much. Please subscribe. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Check out the Stalker series, and yeah, see you all later. Stay safe.